ex-finance guy who lived in Budapest, Hungary for a bit, and he does a lot of graphic design and analytics stuff.
That's all the things I was going to say.
So I hope you have just 30 seconds of stuff you can think of, and you've got till 1:30.
I met Venkat back in the University of Michigan days. Back then he was finishing up his PhD, and I was a liberal arts major doing, I guess, philosophy and literature at the time. And okay. And let's see, I went off to do economics for the Federal Reserve. I did an econ background too at the same time. And I ended up doing sort of forecasting things. After that, I got into financial engineering. Was one semester away from completing the program when I realized I didn't want to work in a bank. And like anyone in that position, I then absconded to Eastern Europe and started a company. You know, so I think that's a perfectly reasonable solution to the problem. I ended up first starting with I started a T-shirt company, and the plan of this was that I would make really expensive T-shirts, and I would make them get more expensive every month. And obviously, it's a great idea. You know, buy it now so that my T-shirts don't become too expensive for you to buy later, and then tell everyone how expensive your T-shirt is. I'm just going to limit the supply. It's going to be fantastic. The problem is this. My misunderstanding of the economy involved here is that there was no demand, so this really didn't work. But at the time, I made a lot of really fun T-shirts. And let's see, at this time, I reconnected with Venkat, and he was looking for a cover designer for his book. So, you know, we sort of talked through and went through this design cycle of what it is to represent what's going on in tempo. And there's a lot there, and that was pretty hard. But, you know, sort of going through the design cycle with him and sort of figuring out like how to express that. There was a point once when he sort of asked like, what's going on with this thing? And I said, oh, well, obviously that's kind of representing this. And he said, what's going on with this thing? And I said, well, that's just totally badass. There's no reason for that. That's just the badass part, you know. And it came that I felt inclined to turn this into a general proclamation of design. And that everything should be either symbolizing and purposeful on the one hand, or the things which are not should just be completely badass. You know, and that is a rule I like to go with on this. And so I don't, let's see, sort of to formalize this, I guess. I like to think of, let's see, on the one hand we have the world over here, and say your mind over here, right? Design to me seems like it's the part where you have an idea and you take that idea and you put it out somewhere, right? There's another process where you sort of go from the world to the mind. This is your sort of empiricism. And this is, I don't know, so this is inductive. This is deductive. This way is statistics. This way is probability. Right, like you have a distribution. What are the things that will come from this distribution when you apply it? You can't read these. These are for me, I guess. So this is more engineering. I'm sorry. This way is more science. This way is engineering. One other would be this is reading, and this is authoring. Right. And the sort of feedback loop between these things, what you're taking in, what you're putting out, what you're taking in a cycle, this is the process of doing something. You know, when you're planning, when you're executing, you have to be receptive to signals from the outside. You have to be putting something out there too, right? So this thesis of everything should be symbolizing or completely badass. This is a representation from here to here. I like to think that empiricism is a good thing in general. It's a good idea that we are responsive to our world. We try and generalize. We try and take things in and turn complicated world into simple things in our head. But design, I think, is necessarily a mind-to-world process. You know, this is a thing where you have to say, look, I got something in my head, and I need to get it out there. So I will take the view of one big idea totalizing some, and that's sort of where this comes from. So going to what the world is about, right? So I drew. The world looks beautiful. I guess it's buildings with dots over it, which is an important component when I look out on any skyline. The sort of model that I have, you know, this lies on this idea of going to, say, maybe statistics as being a way of going world to mind, right? When you're designing, you're kind of going in the opposite direction. So the world is a mess, right? You have a lot of disparate, imperfect points. There's a lot of stuff going on. You can't put the world in your head or your head would explode. The world is big, right? These things are related in predictable ways, but there's different. There's error, there's variance. There's something that you can't take the entire thing. So I would say, like, when looking at a problem, you first, to try and think or to come up with anything, you need to contextualize, right? You say, all right, what am I looking for? How can I, you know, what are the bounds and constraints of what I'm looking at and what I want to get from it? And a model that I like to think about in representing how we go from a set of messy, horrible points is that you have to make a jump at a certain point, right? Like, anytime you have a model, it's going to be imperfect. It's going to be a mess. It's going to be a heuristic, a story, a narrative, an archetype, a set of things which contains fewer epistemological constraints than the original thing. It's going to be, it will always be an imperfect simplification. And that's really what enables you to take this and to turn it into something of meaning. So in that direction, I'd say, you know, if you think back to, like, if you take a linear regression in some sense, right? What you're doing is you're fitting a line that explains this messy world in some way. You're saying, I can explain this, maybe it's a set of circles. Or, you know, the easiest one would be something like line, right? So you do a regression fit, OLS, and you'd say, I have a line that is a fit of these points, and it says, hey, let's minimize the distance between these points and the model. So that, let's say I threw away all the points, I could still get kind of close to where each of them are just by taking this, right? And that point is when we say, look, I've taken this world and I've simplified it to this, all I need to know is actually two things to get this, right? I need to know slope. So the slope is beta, right? And I need to know this side, alpha, or intercept.
Can you use one of the other markers? I think there's new ones.
I'm a big fan of red. Let's see. How's this going? Yeah, it's better. Much better. Yeah. My alpha kind of looks like the essence of the fish. So, going with this of saying, all right, so here's a model, right? When you're just, your first step, your world to mind, is the step where you say, all right, give me a thing. Okay, this is how I can conceptualize the problem. This is what's going on here. I basically understand that as I have more of this, I will probably have more of that. You know, that's this level of simplification. When you're designing, you're kind of going in the other direction. You're saying, whoa, 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 there's this thing in my head. How can I create something that looks like the world on this basis of just this line? So you start with this, and then you kind of jitter it. And that's how you end up with the points in the other direction. I would break this down further and say, you know, so in our beta, the slope, this is the thing that makes it fit. Beta is meaning, it's your interpretation. It's the thing that describes the correspondence between these elements. This is symbolizing. Alpha, that's just the location. That's just the thing that gets you up to where it needs to be. That is the part that I would call completely badass. So everything that happens here on the beta side, you say, why is it this? Why is it this slope? That's what fits the points. That's the one that fits and that describes sort of the correspondence between things. Alpha is the part where you say, I can't explain it, but it needs to be there or it wouldn't work. Right? So I guess I'd say, you know, taking a look at a couple of examples. I don't have printed handouts, but I have this guy, and hopefully technology helps me at the moment. Yeah, so we have the steps of, you know, you contextualize, that is sort of the drawing of the axes. You fit, you get this slope element where you say this is a correspondence between a thing and the world. And then alpha is the point that takes it where it needs to go. And there are a couple of, I guess to take one step further, what happens with getting these wrong and why this still works. If you were to instead have it starting here, kind of going like this, you look at that and you'd say, well, it doesn't fit. I mean, you're representing the wrong thing. What you're doing if you have this, say the wrong beta in your design, is maybe you're fitting a point cloud that's kind of like here, right? Like you're still representing something, but you're representing something else. If you have a setup where maybe you still are on the right line, but you're here, you might say like, okay, well that's kind of a low alpha version of the design. It represents the thing, it's just not very good at that point. It's not badass enough, you know, add a little bit more of that. So, some designs that I would say here, and this is, let's see if I can get out in the middle. This is what I would say maybe something that's just symbolizing, right? Sort of grid-like, you're representing,
Streets.
yeah, streets. This could be a representation of a lot of things, right?
Can you come down a bit?
Yes.
So this-
You have something, a lot of good things you do with this, right? Well, we add a little bit of what I would say, add some alpha to this, right? And all of a sudden, you have laundry on number 2, right? Like there's no reason that it has to be red and blue and yellow in those particular positions, but when they're added, it changes it from grid to arguably badass, right? This is the difference. Oops, wrong slide. Badass. Let's go around. Right, so like, you might ask, oh God, technology, how can you fail me? You might ask like, you know, why would it be yellow in that particular position? And I'm sure there are interpretations you can come up with, but the fact is, red could have become blue. Red could have been yellow. The positions of those things could have been different, but that they are the same is sort of it is the thing that puts it where it is. You know, it's the extra leftover. I can explain these elements, but there's this one point that I can't explain, and if I, you know, and because I can't, I have to rely on this is the right one.
You said that's Mondrian number 2. Is that like
Number
an
2.
abstract expressionist artist?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Sorry. Okay. Back up. So yeah, one slide with the direct comparison. Oh, that's it, right? Another example I would have. Let's take Rothko. On this side, you have what Rothko would look like if you put a cat next to it, a dollar sign, a light bulb, and the scales. If you strip that crap away, you are pure alpha. That's the badass part, right? So this is just make it work. right? This is strip away the unnecessary bits, and you're left with pure badass. One other I would say, like with Apple designs, I would say that this is a breakdown that you can make of saying there are parts that mean something. You know, like the original Apple logo having this is Garden of Eden. This is representing knowledge. This is actually empowerment of people through knowledge, right? This is sort of the stated purpose of the Apple design logo. I would say that's very beta heavy. That's very symbolic. It's a very meaningful thing. I'd say something like the swirling wait icon. It has one symbolizing purpose, right? It's there to tell you you're waiting. But there are a lot of different ways you can show that someone's waiting. The fact that there was a decision made that it would be this colorful beach ball, spinny, malty rainbow kind of thing. For other choices, it could have been, say, the hourglass or something like that, right? That's the other choice that came up in this context. Well, the decision, like, why rainbow? Why these colors versus other spinning sort of things? That's an alpha decision. So I look at this as a model that lets you be able to break down, when looking at a design, the components of it that you think have an interpretation, that have something like that. And then the other side is what is there simply because it needs to be. This extra thing, the pizzazz, the frill, the extra fins on the back of the tuna. Those sorts of things. So that is what I've got. Anyone have any thoughts on alpha or beta or mind to world?
You go back to the Monaco example.
Yeah.
Give your explanation for it.
No. Look at that cat. So this is sort of a, if you tried to be too beta heavy, strip that beta, right? So this is how it would be less meaningful if it were overly symbolic. I hope that my tone hasn't been so serious that this is not come across as playful.
So you're saying the one on the right is just represents nothing, maybe, and
Well, I think it represents a lot of junk. Right?
no, I'm sorry, it's completely bad.
Sorry, yes, completely badass. Well, yes, this is not adding extra beta, and I would say this is a high alpha design with almost zero beta.
So first of all, thanks for a really interesting talk. It's really making me think. I think you're probably mostly completely wrong, but that's.
Don't worry, I do too.
Yeah. But I wanted to bring up kind of an example that making me think of recently, which is this example of Google advertisements. And so they have ads at the top of the page, right? And in some sense, the idea of putting ads at the top of the page that are relevant to the search query, right? That's kind of a beta decision, right? And then the color of the background behind the ads is kind of an alpha decision. But in the case of Google, they actually tested 50 different shades of blue and measured the user response to see what slightly different shade of blue got clicked on more, and use that to optimize revenue. It's kind of an
Yeah.
So I think you might be able to say that maybe the distinction between these things isn't actually tight. You might be able to shift them back and forth depending on what you're able to or willing to measure.
Actually,
Even on that figure on the whiteboard, it's not fair to claim that alpha doesn't affect the fit, because if you reduce alpha, you're actually increasing the distance from the points to the line. So
But, I mean,
they are
when
kind of
you
entangled.
do an OLS fit, you take out alpha from the equation, right?
Oh, I don't know about. I'm just looking at plane geometry here, and like if you move the line down, it would not be as good a fit.
Wait, you mentioned that the axes are in a sense the context in which you're sort of framing your intake of reality. So there's something arbitrary about where you place the axes, and in a sense alpha is cancelling out the arbitrariness
Oh,
of
I
your own
see, I
line.
see.
That's
Okay.
how I read the concept.
That makes sense.
Is that how you see that? Okay.
So you gave us a couple examples. The first one is that I understood your explanations primarily fit with a little bit of badass. And the second one being a lot of badass with very little fit. I mean, maybe the coloration of the horizon is fit or something like that. But we call them both art. We look at them, we take them as kind of aesthetic interpretations, though you're proposing to have kind of different ratios of alpha to beta emphasis. So I'm just curious if you have any thought on specific, when you're designing the cover of tempo, what's your ratio of alpha to beta?
Actually, can you, this copy is there, so maybe you can point out the alpha and beta in the top there.
Oh, yes, I'm gonna go perfect
And
there.
do a little product.
Where is it exactly?
There's one here also.
Okay. Well, I would say it's entirely badass. So let's I think there's, I would call it sort of a beta heavy cover. Like, there were design decisions made to symbolize various things from different chapters and different elements and things like that.
And is that, like, is that somehow respected to the audience? That, or
I think it really is. So I mean, the difference between, I would say, a 2D object like this, where you're only versus say a 3D, like designing a tea kettle or something, right? Is like with an image, you only really have one means of representation. You have your user experience with that is only hermeneutics, basically. It's what interpretation they can get out of it. I can have a lot of different experiences with the tea kettle, like whether it's burning me, whether it's fulfilling its function or something like that. Those are reasonable different kinds of ways it can represent. The only thing this sort of purely visual thing has is interpretation, right? The amount that you would say, I wish as an artist to convey something, versus the amount that you say, I want people to look at this and find it badass. I think it's going to depend on maybe the project and your own inclinations. Sorry. One more?
Kind of also thinking about what we just did with the tea kettle. I mean, I think in the best designs what happens is, you don't actually have a very big distinguishing line between the two things. So for instance, think about the pyramids. What happens is that in the pyramids you need somewhere to bury the king after he dies and all his things that he potentially wants to take with him to the afterworld, right? But, the symbolism or what you're calling beta in the sense, like the symbolism is inherently also in the scale of the pyramid, which in a lot of ways is what you're defining as alpha in some of these things. Like if we're defining beta as what, the symbolism and then A as what it needs to elevate it to there, in the pyramids what you have is everything all combined at the same time, because without the scale, it also wouldn't have the kind of symbolism that it needs to, represent power or heritage, any of those things.
I think I have to answer that during lunch. But, no, I mean, I think like you can do a lot of the things that the pyramids do, perhaps at the lower scale, and the fact that they are as large as they are. I think the fact, actually, let's say the Great Pyramid is greater than the other pyramids. By that amount, that is alpha.
And also the fact that it's a pyramid, right? I mean, scale represents the power of the pharaoh, but why does it have to be a pyramid if there's something badass about that?
And maybe the scale of the pyramid, the physical scale of the pyramid is not the same scale as the scale on that graph. You're talking about different measures, if I'm not mistaken.
The fact that the shape of the pyramid is actually all data, because they didn't have the arch, they didn't have pillars. So they literally, the only thing they could build some of the blocks of rock that was that big was that shape. They couldn't build anything else.
That's a great thought. Why don't we save that?
Go Jane!
That is really a great thought. I love it. Okay, all right. This is going to be the bar camp part now. So we have slightly less time than we'd scheduled for, but that's okay. I'm sure it'll be fine. So what we're going to do now is we are going to come to the whiteboard and we're going to write down some things that we'd like to talk about, and we'll assign each idea to a table. Then you'll just go sit down at the table at the idea for what you're interested in. And it sounds like Adam and Sam and Dick have all generated some really interesting things that we probably want to talk about more, because we were having a hard time keeping things to the timelines. So I am just going to
Erase the world.
Are you going to erase the world? Erase this graph. You guys can remember.
Only changing things
Oh, that sounds scary. So, ideas. How about this is table 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6.
So which one? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah. All right. And if you are interested in talking about an idea, come up and write your name on the right-hand side here. And let's try to come up with at least 12 because we want to have 2 rounds of this. So we're going to talk about 6 things, one per table for 20 minutes, and then we'll switch to a different 6 things in the second 20 minutes. Yeah, right about where we want to talk about. Yeah, we'll just move That's so fun. Absolutely. Anything you want to talk about, anything is fine. Yeah, as long as it's vaguely related to what this refactoring and everybody needs.